the business of tariffs. It has been a slogan throughout his government and essentially a stick to beat trading partners with, and to present this posture as a muscular president who is standing up to aggressive foreign trading partners. That's the way tariffs have been presented. Donald Trump pointing to China and others and saying they've been ripping us off for years, I'm going to do something about it. And tariffs, that's what he's presented as, this silver bullet. Hasn't been prepared to go through proper due process, to go via Congress, and that's where he has come unstuck in this regard. One of the things about tariffs, Emma, is there is much debate about their effectiveness. Of course, they are controversial because tariffs are paid by the importing companies. So the argument for those opposed has been, hang on a minute, you're imposing tariffs, but that will be paid by the American importer. The American importer will pass on that cost to the consumer. And bear in mind, Donald Trump came to power promising to bring down the cost of living. That has not necessarily been reflected, despite the fact that tariffs have been on the go for months, and despite the fact the United States has pulled in something around $100 billion in tariff revenue. The customer, the people who voted for Donald Trump to give them a feel-good financial factor, they're not feeling the benefit. So that's bad for him, but this clearly is bad for him in terms of his political stature, a man who invested much in tariffs as a tool to enhance his standing as president. A significant blow for Donald Trump.
Indeed. We're just actually having a quick look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average there, seeing if there's any market move. As you say, James, it is a huge political pillar of President Trump's second term, and just wanting to see whether the market's moving. It's actually taking all in its stride, which is unusual to say the least, because this could have massive economic repercussions for the world's largest economy, could it not? I mean, he's put tariffs into pretty much every relationship that he's got with other countries globally. It's become a foreign policy tool as much as an economic tool, hasn't it?
That's right, yeah. Some tough negotiations now start, I suppose, and trading partners will feel empowered. I mean, the United Kingdom is among them, of course, pretty much a 10% tariff on most goods with the United Kingdom. There is an EPD, an economic partnership deal that was signed several months ago under the auspices of the then UK ambassador, Peter Mandelson. Pharmaceuticals free of tariffs, a likelihood of 25% on steel and aluminium that could disappear. That EPD is due to still be enacted in full between the UK and the United States. But of course, you know, everything, I suppose, now is up for review given the history. I'm just looking at some of the news coming through. This broke from the Supreme Court at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Emma, basically, it comes through the computer. They post on their website the results. It was a 66-3 vote against Donald Trump. There were dissenting judges, and I'm just looking at Brett Kavanaugh, who dissented, a judge, of course, who was appointed by Donald Trump. Let me just read to you the reason he didn't think this was a good idea, and I'm seeing this fresh. He's saying, Brett Kavanaugh, the court's decision is not likely to greatly restrict presidential tariff authority going forward. That's interesting. But he does say the court's decision is likely to generate other serious practical consequences in the near term. One issue, he says, will be refunds. Refunds of billions of dollars would have significant consequences, he says, for the US Treasury. The court says nothing today about whether, and if so, how, the government should go about returning the billions of dollars that it has collected from importers. But that process is likely to be a mess, as was acknowledged at oral argument. So that's Brett Kavanaugh, one of the judges, who's saying, look, this is not a good idea. We should stick with Donald Trump on his tariffs. He's talking about a mess when it comes to refunds, and he's talking about uncertainty about the billions of dollars, significant consequences, he says, for the US Treasury. Donald Trump from yesterday, and we heard some of it there, he was in Rome, Georgia, and he did address the Supreme Court tariff case. And yesterday he said, without tariffs, this country would be in such trouble right now, he said. And Trump yesterday said, you know who brought these cases against us? People that are China-oriented, people that have business in China that want to rip us off and keep ripping us off, and the tariffs have stopped us. So there you go. That was Donald yesterday. One imagines that that's how he will spin this result today. I wonder if he had a tip-off that the wind was blowing against him. Certainly that's a sense we got from the oral arguments inside the Supreme Court. But that's Donald Trump, essentially somebody else's fault. And I'm just looking at other comments that he was saying yesterday. I have the right to do it as president. Without tariffs, what would you do? You know what? Everyone would be bankrupt. Everybody, the whole country would be bankrupt. So screaming headlines in advance of this result, this judgment from Donald Trump. But I tell you, it's one screaming headline from the Supreme Court that he does not have the right to implement one of his key flagship headline policies.
James Matthews, for now, thank you very much for that analysis. Let's bring in now some more expert views, and we can speak to Professor of Economics at Cambridge University, Meredith Crowley, on what is breaking news that the US Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's sweeping tariffs that he pursued under a law meant for use in national emergencies, according to them. We appreciate you taking time to talk to us on this breaking news story, Meredith. What do you make of it?
I think that this was not unexpected at all. So just to say, the United States Constitution very clearly lays the power to tax with the United States Congress. And so this step that the president took in making claims that he was going to use this Emergency Economic Powers Act to try to raise revenue through tariffs was clearly an overreach of presidential authority. The reason, as my understanding is of the legal issue, why it did need to go to the Supreme Court was because there was a little bit of ambiguity in this Emergency Economics Powers Act, and no president had tried to use it in this way before. And over the last 50 years, the executive branch of the U.S. government has gotten more and more power, just because it's more efficient in many ways to give the leader of a country some freedom to act very, quickly in response to emerging situations. But where the president was trying to use this emergency act to take Congress's authority to set tax policy for the United States was really not appropriate according to the Constitution. And so I think it's unsurprising that the Supreme Court confirmed that the power to tax remains with the U.S. Congress. In some sense, it's a diverse institution with a lot of people across the United States participating in it. And it's really a more democratic way to establish tax policy.
You sound very relaxed for a story that sounds completely messy, in my opinion. But Meredith, where does this leave then the tariffs, the trade tariffs, which are on the table? I mean, this has been, we can't underestimate just how enormous this has been as an economic policy for the president and the impact that it's had on global trade and on many, if not all, other countries around the world. I mean, where does it lie now?
Well, that's a good question. Clearly, businesses who moved their supply chains out of China into Mexico, into Vietnam, all of the reoriented trade flows around the world in response to the president's use of this tax authority are now going to be asking themselves, what happens next? Will these tariffs stay in place? So the president can very quickly, if he would like to, go to the U.S. Congress and say, I set some tariffs on China. I thought this was the right thing to do. Would you go and write a bill now to create these same tariffs? And I think that if he'd done this maybe, a year and a half ago, the Congress might have quickly jumped and said, sure, you want to have high tariffs on China, we'll go with it. I think, the last 3 months, there's been less support for the president's agenda on various issues within the Congress. So it's questionable whether or not he will have success if he puts forward a bill, requests Congress to raise all of these tariffs, if he can get that through Congress. If he can't, he still has other options. So a very typical option that was used before, Trump became president, all throughout the administrations of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, presidents before them, was we have special provisions in U.S. law. One is the anti-dumping provision. There's another set of tariffs called the safeguard tariff. These would allow tariffs to be put in place if the government brings a case and says, trade in this particular good is too high, it causes damage to the U.S. economy, we want a tariff put in place. Certainly what's known as Section 201 safeguard tariffs absolutely remain an option on the table for the president. The executive branch can go forward with them, but they get reviewed by a quasi-judicial
we have to leave it there.
Sorry, yeah.
Thank you so much. No, we appreciate your thoughts and your expert views. Do come back and talk to us soon. Professor of Economics at Cambridge University, Meredith Crowley, thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to say we're also joined now by the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, joining me now live from Edinburgh. Of course, so you were talking at the Conservative Party conference a short while ago. A lot going on at Sky News Centre this afternoon, Kemi, in terms of breaking news. And so whilst you're here, let's just get your views on this news coming across the news wires about the US Supreme Court striking down President Trump's sweeping tariffs, saying that that power belongs in Congress, not in the White House. What are your thoughts on that?
So from our perspective, what is in the British national interest? This is very good news. I was the UK's Trade Secretary for 2 years, and I travelled all around the world working to bring tariffs down. Tariffs are bad for both sides. The consumer in the country that's putting on the tariffs has to pay more, and they also make it harder for the other country to sell. I understand what President Trump was trying to do. He's trying to protect industry in the US. We need to do the same here. But tariffs should be used carefully to stop, dumping from China or other countries, flooding your market, breaking rules. That's when you use tariffs. You might use them during short periods to help a particular area for very brief periods. What President Trump did was quite sweeping. I spoke against it at the time. I said it wasn't what Ronald Reagan would do. We are free trading nations. The UK is a trading country. So overall, this is good news for us. Let's hope it holds.
You believe that if you had been Prime Minister or our Prime Minister at the time, that you would have been able to persuade President Trump not to impose trade tariffs on the UK?
Well, yes. Remember, when we were last in government, we were actually negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement, not a little tariff deal, which was going up and down. We had good relations with the White House at the time. We still do. We've been having lots of conversations with them as a Conservative Party about this terrible Chagos deal, which Keir Starmer has been negotiating. I mean, if people think what President Trump has been doing is bad, they need to look at what Keir Starmer has been negotiating. He sells the UK down the river at every opportunity, because he doesn't know how to negotiate. We need something better.
OK, and I will talk to you about Chagos in just a few minutes, I promise. But first, I can't start the interview without talking to you about Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Of course, I'm sure you were watching with the rest of the world news of his arrest yesterday. What is your reaction to what's been happening?
I think the King is absolutely right to have said what he said. The law must run its course. No one is above the law, not even members of the royal family. I think that's right. And what those of us in public life should do now is give the police the space to carry out their investigation. In fact, what I think is really interesting is the contrast between how His Majesty has handled this situation versus how the Prime Minister handled a situation with Peter Mandelson, also embroiled in this Jeffrey Epstein scandal. The Prime Minister spent his time covering it up, not wanting to release papers, telling people that Mandelson was doing a fantastic job until he could hide it no longer, and then he had to sack him. I think the King has set an exemplary example.
Do you think King Charles has got this right? In effect, do you think that he's able to protect the institution of the monarchy and also have care over his brother?
I think that the King has got this absolutely right, a very difficult line to walk, but the monarchy is more than any one individual. It is one of our country's greatest institutions. We are a constitutional monarchy, and I think that the fact that he took a tough decision and previously had stripped Prince Andrew of his titles shows that he took this very seriously. He is thinking about the future of our country, of our constitutional monarchy, not just himself.
And yet, Andrew is still in line to the throne, isn't he? Do you think Parliament should be looking at legislating to remove that right?
I think right now, Parliament and people in public life need to focus on letting the police carry out this investigation. This is not yet a charge. He's been spoken to. We need to let that process run through its course fully before we start talking about other things.
Davy's gone further, the Liberal Democrat leader. He says Parliament could have a role to play. I mean, as leader of the opposition, would you support that if he made a move?
I think he's saying something so that he can get on the news. Right now, the people who have a serious role to play are the police, and we need to let them carry out their duties. Parliament should spend more time looking at what the Prime Minister is doing. We are still waiting for the full release of all of the files surrounding the scandal of Peter Mandelson. The Prime Minister sacked the Cabinet Secretary who was overseeing the release of those files. He's just appointed a brand new person. I think Parliament has got a lot of work to do cleaning out its own house.
Yeah, the reason I keep bringing this up is a YouGov poll that was released just a few hours ago has found that 82% of people think that Andrew should be removed from being in the royal line of succession. People really, really care about this, but you're not prepared to take a position on it?
Right now, I think we should let the police do their job and focus on the actual job we have in hand. As leader of the opposition, my job is to hold the Prime Minister to account, not Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Let the police do their job. The person who I need to focus on is Keir Starmer, who's doing a terrible job, who is covering up the release of the files around Peter Mandelson. I'm doing my job, and I want to focus on priorities, not just chase what's in the newspapers on a particular day. That would be me not doing my job.
OK, and one final question. I mean, would you welcome Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor into Parliament? Do you think that he should face questions from a committee of MPs, perhaps?
No, I think that he should face police questions, which is what is happening. Parliament should do its job of holding the Prime Minister to account. Let's not forget, he also, because he appointed Peter Mandelson, has now got himself embroiled in this Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Parliament should focus on the job it has been elected to do, and part of the job of the opposition is making sure that the government is being held to account. I think the government is very happy for people to be distracted by what's happening to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. I'm not going to be distracted from doing my job.
OK, I'd love to get your views on lots of foreign news that's happening this weekend in particular, and certainly today. We know that Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary, is currently in Washington meeting her counterpart, Marco Rubio. I mean, you were on Sky News just a few weeks ago saying that Iran is the big story, it's the big issue you're concerned with right now. And we hear from President Trump that military action could take place as soon as this weekend. He says that they are ready. One Saturday, that's tomorrow. How concerned are you about this geopolitical positioning and geopolitical position right now?
Well, this has been building up for a very long time. And it's why this deal that the Prime Minister is striking on the Chagos Islands is so important and has come into the fore. Iran is a malign influence in that part of the Middle East. In fact, it's a malign influence all over the world. It has tried to kill people on our soil. We know that it is a terrible regime, brutalizes its own people. And if there is any action that is in the British national interest, I think that the UK should look at that, look at what is right for our national security. But of course I'm concerned. This is an escalation. There are very serious questions of national security that need to be thought through. And sadly right now I think we've got a Prime Minister and a Labour government who are distracted with their own problems.
On the issue of the Chagos Islands, I know there's something that you've talked about an awful lot. There are reports that the UK government would not permit US forces to use British air bases for any strike because of international legal concerns. And that's maybe one of the reasons why President Trump has come out against the Chagos deal just a few days ago. Would you allow them? Would you allow them to use UK bases to strike Iran?
If it's in the UK national interest, then yes. It is more important for me, as leader of the Conservative Party, to make sure that UK bases are being used for action that is in UK interest, more important than listening to an advisory ruling by a court that has other interests that it's thinking about. We need to look after our country, our national security, our national interest. That's what we're elected to do.
OK, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Kemi Badenoch, there, leader of the Conservative Party, up in Scotland on the back of their Scottish Conservative conference. For our political correspondent, Rob Powers, listening to that interview. Lots and lots to talk to you about. You go ahead and tell us what you think was most interesting. So a hard line then on Iran and, of course, on the Chagos Islands.
Yeah, of course, and that reaction from Kemi Badenoch on the Supreme Court decision stateside as well. I think the Conservatives generally, when it comes to Donald Trump's sweeping tariff regime, have been a lot more outspoken than Labour and the government have been. I think that's probably, in large part, the luxury of opposition, the luxury of not actually having to sit around the table with people like Donald Trump and his team and negotiate, and not having to sort of foster those more direct diplomatic relations that any government in power in the UK has to do. So Kemi Badenoch essentially saying that she believes this is sort of the right decision, I guess, by the court, that she'd always spoken out against the tariffs put on by Donald Trump on various countries, including, of course, the UK, although we did get some carve-outs in that deal agreed by the UK government, and also talking about her time as International Trade Secretary and saying that the way that these tariffs were being used was wrong by Donald Trump. So being quite forthright in her views about that. In terms of what we will get from the government, my hunch is on a Friday in recess, basically Parliament's on break at the moment, so there's no lobby briefings, the daily media briefings we get. I suspect that the government will try and say as little as possible about this in the short term. Their reaction when we had those Donald Trump Freedom Day tariffs was to not take any sort of knee-jerk reaction. That's been the broader approach, really, from Number 10 and Keir Starmer towards some of the quite, at times, wild announcements coming out from the White House. They've not wanted to get dragged into the daily ups and downs of what Donald Trump is putting on Truth Social and what policy pronouncements he is making. In part because you're never quite sure what's going to happen next. In part, it's because of something like this, the Supreme Court judgment coming along and the whole story changing once more. What we, of course, do know, though, is that the UK and the US did sign a deal that carved the UK out from elements of the tariff regime that Donald Trump wanted to put on exports coming from the UK. That involved some concessions, compromises on the UK side. They were generally around things like regulations, regulatory standards, alignment with the US on some goods as well. What we thought when that US-UK deal was sort of being cooked up was that there could be something a little more headline grabbing, if you like, something like the UK dropping the digital services tax on Silicon Valley US companies. That didn't come to pass. I think if it had come to pass, there would be many people now wondering, well, why on earth did we cave and give in and make concessions on this when there was always, I guess, a legal question mark over the Trump tariffs, because now the sort of political construct of that deal, I guess, is kind of messed with and muddled with a little bit, because we did that deal to try and get a carve-out from the Donald Trump tariffs. Well, now the highest court in the land in the United States has said that those tariffs may well not stand. So I guess a lot now depends on what Donald Trump does next and the practical impact of this Supreme Court ruling. As I say, if we get any kind of response from the UK government in the short term, though, I suspect it'll be quite bland and boring, and merely we are working through the consequences of this, talking to our US counterparts and trying to figure out what it practically means.
Glad you said that, because we've just had some response from the UK government. I can tell you right now, doing your job for you, Rob. We're just coming from PA, job dropping over the wires in the last few minutes. The government, they say they are working with the US to understand how the overturning of Donald Trump's tariffs will affect the UK, but goes on to say they expect our privileged trading position with the US to continue. That's a government spokesman there giving us the very latest on the news that the US Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's key economic plank or policy on tariffs. And we shall bring you more global reaction, of course, UK reaction, when we get it here on Sky News. But we have more breaking news to bring you from a completely different story now. And Sky News understands that the Football Association has issued Sir Jim Ratcliffe with a warning over comments that he made to us about the UK being colonised by immigrants. Our sports correspondent Rob Harris has much more for us now. He joins us live on the telephone now. And of course, his comments just remind us what he said, and they're, of course, widely condemned at the time. Rob.
Yes, it was a week ago that Sir Jim Ratcliffe, the Ineos billionaire and Manchester United co-owner, told Sky News data and economics editor Ed Conway that the UK has been colonised by immigrants. He went on to argue that that's draining resources from the state. This led to the Football Association saying that they were going to look into whether or not he was bringing the game into disrepute. I now understand that the Football Association has issued Sir Jim Ratcliffe with a reminder of his responsibilities as a co-owner of Manchester United when taking part in interviews, but he won't be facing any further action. Now, Sir Jim himself did say last week he was sorry that his choice of language has offended some people and caused concern. But then in that statement, he went on to reiterate his belief that the government needs to do more to control immigration. And that is a broad policy of Labour, the Conservatives, and indeed Reform. It's the particular word colonise that provoked the outrage, with the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, condemning Sir Jim for making those comments. Also, we heard from the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, who said those comments were insulting, inflammatory and incorrect. But the Reform leader, Nigel Farage, did say that in the dictionary definition, the word colonise is probably correct, but people aren't ready for it. This placed Manchester United in a very difficult situation. The Glazers do remain the majority owners, but day-to-day control of the club for the last 2 years has been with Sir Jim since he bought around 30% of the club. So United themselves put their own statement out, effectively distancing themselves from Sir Jim last week, not naming him, but reiterating their own commitment to promotion of inclusion and diversity at the club. We've also been hearing for the first time from the Manchester United men's manager, Michael Carrick, today, who said that equality and diversity and respect is something they look to carry through every day. But he didn't want to talk about Sir Jim directly. And the concern from these comments from groups like the Manchester United Supporters Club is that Sir Jim using that word colonise will give power and strength to those who feel that minority communities don't belong in the country. And the focus on the word colonise in particular echoed for some the far-right great replacement theory, which did cause that concern, particularly from the politicians who demanded he retract them, and Sir Jim partially did. But this damaging episode for Manchester United, with their co-owner Sir Jim Ratcliffe investigated by the Football Association, but now the FA, we understand, reminding Sir Jim Ratcliffe of his responsibilities as a participant in English football when taking part in interviews, but they will not be taking any further action against him.
OK, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Rob Harris, the very latest on those comments made by Sir Jim Ratcliffe. We'll bring you the very latest for you, all the breaking news, including the US Supreme Court deciding to strike down President Trump's global trade tariffs, coming up after this short break. Welcome back. You're watching Sky News. Let's continue with our breaking news of the news that the US Supreme Court has just struck down in the last half an hour or so. President Trump's sweeping tariffs that he's pursued, saying they were meant under a law meant for use in national emergencies, basically rejecting one of his most contentious assertions of his authority in a ruling that could have implications for the global economy. Well, let's get the views now of a former UK chief trade negotiator, Sir Crawford Falconer. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us so quickly here on Sky News. I mean, this was, and it still is, a key economic pillar of the Trump administration. How big a blow is it?
Oh, I think it's a big blow. It will constrain the administration as it goes forward. I have no doubt that they will revert to other methods, and there are other avenues open to them, but none of them will have the flexibility and the kind of immediacy of what has been struck down by the Supreme Court. So I don't think you should be popping the champagne corks if you're trading with the US in goods, because I suspect that A, you're going to have a period of uncertainty, and B, there will undoubtedly be other measures which they take. Whether they are ultimately justified if they go to court as well remains to be seen. But I have little doubt the administration will use perhaps some very, very old and very obscure provisions which nobody really knows what they mean, at least as a means in the meantime to keep some measures on. But I think it's a real body blow to what they have been doing.
And estimates put it at about $175 billion that's already been taken because of the tariffs, which may need to be paid back. I mean, what an administrative headache, if nothing else.
Well, I mean, it's serious money for the people who've been paying the tariffs, but more than a headache. And the thing is, as far as I understand it, and I mean, I've had a very, very quick look at the opinion, I don't think the Supreme Court hasn't specified or directed what should happen about reclaiming those tariffs. So it doesn't immediately mean that you're going to get your money back. The processes of how that will be done will have to be resolved through lower courts. And that will take some considerable time. So it won't go back onto the bottom line of the affected companies overnight. But it does mean that for the moment, once that opinion has been out, then they can't keep applying them. That's for sure.
Of course, you are a former UK chief trade negotiator, so you know about this more than anyone. The UK, of course, being hit on steel, on car parts. I mean, for companies that are based in the UK that trade into the United States, what do you say to them?
Well, first of all, I mean, a rather technical thing, which is rather important, which is that for steel and cars, this won't affect it. This is the powers that he applied under what's called IEEPA. I know it all sounds rather confusing, and it is. But that's a very particular power that he used to apply the cross-the-board tariffs. But for steel and autos and for some others, they were applied under what's called Section 232, and they weren't subject to this judgment. So if you're a steel exporter, you're still going to be clobbered by tariffs, and the tariffs that were applied for autos are still going to be applicable, and a number of the other sectors are there. So it gets rid of the cross-the-board tariffs, which were the ones that were initially outlined, but at the sectoral level, these so-called 232 tariffs, they're still applicable. So if you're in a sector that has those, this judgment doesn't have any effect on it.
We're actually just having some comment from the British Chambers of Commerce. It would be good to get your thoughts on that. They're saying that the US Supreme Court tariff decision adds uncertainty. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, it adds uncertainty, but I mean, that sounds a bit prejudicial. I mean, the uncertainty derives from the application of the tariffs in the first place. And yes, it does mean that, one set of measures that's been applied has now been struck down. And so therefore you had a pretty bad deal, which was set in place. So you now have uncertainty that the bad deal has been removed. But I think the uncertainty is probably a little bit better than what you had before. But it is true that you don't know what is now going to apply next. There are some possibilities that people can guess at. If you're subject to 232, one assumes the 232 tariffs still apply. But if you have IEEPA tariffs applied to you, which are the things that really have globally had the big effect, you really don't know. And it may well be, for some of the tariffs the UK faces, if they revert to different authorities to apply tariffs, the 10% tariff that the UK has obtained under its deal with the US might actually be at risk. I mean, if they have to apply another section of the Trade Act, they might have to go to 15% on everybody if they follow it by the letter of the law. So yes, there is a degree of uncertainty for traders, but there's been uncertainty with this administration since the day they came in. But yes, for the UK, which had a relatively privileged position, there's a bit of a question as to whether it will be able to sustain it. But one assumes that the political reasons for that applying might still apply. But yes, at the moment, it's a bit uncertain. The initial market's reactions has been positive, but how they will be at the end of the day remains to be seen.
Yeah, we're keeping an eye on the markets as we speak. The Supreme Court voting 6-3 to strike down this ruling. Is this a decisive move, do you think, to hand power back to Congress away from the White House?
Well, I think it's a decisive act against the unilateral power of the president to operate in this way. I'm a little bit hesitant to say that it's handing something back to Congress per se. It's not that kind of directed. But until I've had a chance to read the whole opinion and to get the advice of people who are far better lawyers than me, I'm not quite sure of how the reasoning goes. If the reasoning is very clear that this is a reflection of the fundamental separation of powers between the president and the Congress, and that's clear and explicit as part of the logic that underlies it, that is very important because it gives a sense of direction of whatever the administration may want to do in the future. Will have to recognize the underlying reasoning that the Supreme Court has applied. But that requires one to sit down and read it very carefully. They may well have taken a less direct interpretation of things. So that's something that I will want to read, and I want to read the advice of the experts on it. But certainly, while that's a bit more obscure to people doing business on a daily basis, it does matter because it does mean that if they're going to have further measures, then the same logic would be applied by them, one would assume, by the court, if they exceeded the authority that those particular measures on the face apply. For instance, there's one authority which talks about having a measure you can apply, but it's limited to 150 days. So if the logic of what the Supreme Court has said is very clear, then it would be unlikely the administration could just play with that and keep extending it because it was convenient. If they weren't so clear in their reasoning, then you might have to face that kind of constant battle issue by issue. But that'll take a day or two before that's clear. Well, it may take even less than a day if the experts are fairly clear on it fairly quickly.
OK, we'll leave it there. We appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. So Crawford Faulkner there on the very latest on this breaking news story. And actually, we're just getting some comment coming through from the UK Department of Trade saying this is a matter for the US to determine, but we will continue to support UK businesses as further details are announced. The UK enjoys the lowest reciprocal tariffs globally, and under any scenario we expect our privileged trading position with the US to continue. We will work with the administration to understand how the ruling will affect tariffs for the UK and for the rest of the world. Of course, plenty more on that when we have it. Well, earlier I got reaction from the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
So from our perspective, what is in the British national interest? This is very good news. I was the UK's Trade Secretary for 2 years, and I travelled all around the world working to bring tariffs down. Tariffs are bad for both sides. The consumer in the country that's putting on the tariffs has to pay more, and they also make it harder for the other country to sell. I understand what President Trump was trying to do. He's trying to protect industry in the US. We need to do the same here. But tariffs should be used carefully to stop dumping from China or other countries flooding your market, breaking rules. That's when you use tariffs. You might use them during short periods to help a particular area for very brief periods. What President Trump did was quite sweeping. I spoke against it at the time. I said it wasn't what Ronald Reagan would do. We are free trading nations. The UK is a trading country. So overall, this is good news for us. Let's hope it holds.
You believe that if you had been Prime Minister or are Prime Minister at the time, that you would have been able to persuade President Trump not to impose trade tariffs on the UK?
Well, yes. Remember, when we were last in government, we were actually negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement, not a little tariff deal, which was going up and down. We had good relations with the White House at the time. We still do. We've been having lots of conversations with them as a Conservative Party about this terrible Chagos deal, which Keir Starmer has been negotiating. I mean, if people think what President Trump has been doing is bad, they need to look at what Keir Starmer has been negotiating. He sells the UK down the river at every opportunity, because he doesn't know how to negotiate. We need something better.
Well, there it was, Kemi Badenoch talking to me just a few minutes ago regarding the very latest on the breaking news from the US Supreme Court as they are striking down President Trump's sweeping global trade tariffs and giving power, they say, back to Congress. They say that he has pursued a law meant for use in national emergencies, rejecting, of course, one of his most contentious assertions of his authority in a ruling which will have major implications for the UK and businesses based in the UK, but also for other global companies and countries around the world. Well, as we know from Independence Day, back this time last year, or in April of last year, President Trump has very effectively leveraged tariffs. They are, of course, taxes on imported goods. That's a very key economic and also a foreign policy tool. Will have to be seen now what they do in terms of response. No response as of yet from the US president. The very latest pictures coming in there. And also a latest comment coming from the UK government spokesman saying that we will continue to work with the administration to understand how the ruling will affect tariffs for the UK and indeed the rest of the world. Very good afternoon to you. It is 4 o'clock and breaking news this afternoon. President Trump's sweeping global tariffs are struck down by the US Supreme Court. In a blow to the president's administration, the government could now face a massive outlay to refund taxes it collected from the levies. Well, the UK government has responded in the last few minutes to that Supreme Court ruling, saying this is a matter for the US to determine, but we will continue to support UK businesses as further details are announced. It goes on to say the UK enjoys the lowest reciprocal tariffs globally, and under any scenario, we expect our privileged trading position with the US to continue. We will work with the US administration to understand how the ruling will affect tariffs for the UK and the rest of the world. Also in response, in the last hour, the British Chamber of Commerce has been speaking. It says decisions also raise questions on whether the UK exporters can receive a share of any rebate, depending on commercial trading terms. It is a complex and a fast-moving story. Let's bring in our US correspondent, James Matthews, with the very latest for us. And James, what do you make of it?
It's a shocking Supreme Court ruling, shocking for Donald Trump. I have to say, I don't think it was entirely unexpected, Emma. We had Donald Trump yesterday at a steel plant talking about tariffs, talking about how a judgment against him legally would be a very bad thing with bad consequences for all. I suspect that he saw this coming, but I mean, the danger for him now is clearly political as well as it is economic. His whole foreign trade policy had tariffs at the heart of it. I mean, it was very much the architecture of his presidency in terms of how he did business abroad and also in terms of how he delivered on his promises to reduce the cost of living for America and Americans. It was the big stick that he waved, presenting himself as the muscular president who would go to war on behalf of Americans with countries he said had been ripping off the country. And of course, what's happened is that countries around the world, Canada and so on, doing business with China, everybody is looking elsewhere, away from America, for opportunities with, on trade, because those same countries don't feel they can trust the United States in the way that they were once able to. So that's bad for Trump. That has been bad. But he's always had tariffs to cling to as the policy that would see this country through. That policy, of course, is up in the air now, along with the economic chaos that it threatens. Donald Trump himself has said this would be a complete mess if the Supreme Court went against him. And that has been echoed by one of the Supreme Court judges today, Brett Kavanaugh, Kavanaugh, talking about how, there's uncertainty surrounding refunds, talking about a mess, just in terms, and it will be a mess in terms of how the resettlement plays out with countries, but also companies, of course, who have been charged in grand style as a result of these tariffs. Tariffs brought in around $100 billion to the US Treasury as of late last year. So there is much to be sorted out. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, he said before this judgment that there were other laws the US could rely on for tariffs, workarounds, essentially. But, politically, this was front and centre for Donald Trump. It strengthened him in terms of his rhetoric and his political stature. It was the big promise. Tariffs, he said, was the most beautiful word in the English dictionary. He was welded to it as a policy, most significant in his presentation as the muscular president to the American public. And, of course, it's in shreds rather now. He was a president who was prepared to rip up the script, and critics, that concerned them. They said this was a president, who would rip up the script, who would drive a coach and horses through the US Constitution. And the Supreme Court judges have rather sided with that view today, saying, look, this is not something that can be done unilaterally. This business of tariffs under an Emergency Powers Act, they're saying, actually, it's a tax. And if you're raising taxes, that has to go through the US Congress. So many people have been concerned about the checks and balances on Donald Trump, the backstop that would rein him in. Critics will be heartened by what they see from the Supreme Court as a credible backstop that, in their view, can preserve the US Constitution and preserve the traditions of a democratic republic.
Okay, James, for now, thank you very much. Plenty more from James Matthews when we have it. Just want to bring you some breaking news. We have had reaction, it seems, from President Trump. This is reported by our sister station, NBC. Apparently, President Trump was informed of the Supreme Court's decision to strike down most of his tariff policy while he was meeting with a bipartisan group of governors. He called the ruling a disgrace, according to a person familiar with his reaction. He also went on to tell The Room this morning that he had a backup plan, according to that person who was there to listen to that. And that's something that certainly the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has also alluded to. Well, let's get the views now of Niall Stanage, who is Associate Editor at The Hill, joining us live here on Sky News today, this afternoon. And of course, this news breaking just in the last hour, so I appreciate you haven't had time to digest it as much as I'm sure you would like to. But it is a very big story, isn't it? And maybe not entirely unexpected, but still it's going to be a big shock through Washington, D.C. and indeed the global markets. What do you make of it?
Oh, yes, it's an enormous story. I mean, the tariffs were the keystone of Trump's economic policy, and that keystone has been removed. You noted these remarks within the past few minutes where the president has described the ruling as a disgrace. He can describe it that way if he likes. The fact of the matter is there is a 6-3 conservative majority on the US Supreme Court, including 3 justices he himself nominated, and 3 of the conservatives sided with the liberal-leaning justices to strike down Trump's move under this emergency law. So I think that is enormously significant, both in terms of policy and in terms of the legality of his action.
What does that say to you?
I think it says that there is real concern among particularly obviously the 6 justices who struck down this law about an exceeding of power. And we see this, of course, in the Trump presidency in a number of areas, constantly pushing at the boundaries, constantly suggesting that his own power transcends Congress's power or the court's law or his political opponents' positions. And so I think there is a real issue here for him, where even a very conservative Supreme Court has said, no, you can't do this.
I just want to take a step back, if you don't mind, and talk about tariffs. So those of us who aren't necessarily so familiar with how they work, we know that they are a central plank to President Trump's economic policy. He calls them the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Why do you think they have become so important to him and his administration in terms of what he's trying to do economically, but also in terms of foreign policy around the world?
In short, Donald Trump, for all his public life, including well before he was in politics, has taken the view that the United States gets ripped off by foreign nations. And he sees tariffs as a way to fix that, as a way to correct that imbalance. He also does not buy the common economic argument that tariffs are by their nature inflationary. So he sees the use of tariffs as a way to flex American muscle. And he further argues that the costs will be swallowed by importers or by, I should say, foreign manufacturers, not by the American consumer, because the American market is so important. Now, that's a whole other debate that we could have. The point here is the Supreme Court has said using this law to impose tariffs in these circumstances is illegal, is unconstitutional.
He says there's a plan B. He said that this morning. What could that be?
Basically, the plan B is to use other laws and other authorities to impose tariffs. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about this by its very nature, but the administration, though it badly wanted to win this Supreme Court case, isn't taking the view that, well, that means the end of our pro-tariff policy. Rather, their position is we will have to find a workaround using other laws or other executive powers toward the same end. Of course, that doesn't mean that every tariff is replicated precisely under those other powers.
In the meantime, it's just horribly complicated, isn't it? I mean, just from this first readout, they talk about nearly 180 billion US dollars, which have already been paid by other countries into US businesses that may need to be refunded. How do they go about even thinking about that?
Honestly, I think nobody really knows. But the bigger point on that issue, I think, is that Trump, given his demeanor, his personality, would almost certainly see a repayment of those tariffs as a humiliation for him. And humiliation is probably the thing that he most bridles against. Now, is that going to lead to another legal clash if those refunds are not forthcoming? We'll have to see. That's one of the many pieces of this jigsaw that are in flux at the moment. Not to mix my metaphors too badly.
And from a UK's perspective, we have had comment from the UK Trade Department. We know, of course, there have been tariffs imposed on the UK. We know that steel's been in the firing line, so too cars and car parts. For UK businesses who sell into the States, some relief for them, perhaps? And what's your take on that?
There does seem to be general relief in the business community, both in Britain and here in the US, for example. The stock markets have risen since this news. But I think the caveat to that is simply this degree of lack of clarity as to where things go from here. Broadly speaking, businesses tend to be anti-tariff. So tariffs being struck down is good for them, be they in Britain or anywhere else. But what happens next? That's what we don't know with any specificity or any concrete detail. And that, I think, would be the thing that would concern businesses.
OK, we appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much for talking to us. Niall Stanage, live there from The Hill. Thank you.